Yeah, I'm Kaji. You looking for a bodyguard? You want me to do what? Fine, pay up. You're watching Campaign Spotlight. Yeah, now get out of here.
Hey there, Dampari and Vergs.
In this week's episode, we're chatting with Andrew about writing, story, and plot for a large, ongoing, live-action roleplay world.
A special thanks to Legacies LARP for making Andrew available for this interview.
Let's roll initiative.
When joining Legacies LARP, you find yourself first in the town of Fortnight. Fortnight is a town that is a little bit more rough and tumble than one might expect. It's an area that is on the edge of the wastes. You're in the country of Warwick. Warwick is a lot like the Pacific Northwest itself, where as you travel across Warwick, some of it is heavily forested. The far eastern parts are a little bit more desert-like. We're in the western portion of Warwick, which is the earldom of Drakenveld. Fortnite itself is a town that attracts those who are looking for adventure. They're looking for mystery. They're looking for sometimes just a fight. And we collect those who are ordinary or extraordinary. And so those people who come to Fortnite find themselves oftentimes in the center of really extreme events. Everything from demonic plagues to fairy nonsense as they are trying to move mortals about as if pieces on a chessboard. We've had invasions from other countries, but in our game world and our story as it currently plays, we are currently dealing with another lordship that has decided it's had enough of the current goings on. They've had enough of how things are going. They've had enough of people being pushed around by monsters from the wastes or demons coming in, and they've decided to invade Fortnite. They've decided to try and take Fortnite from its current lord. And as a player, you find yourself caught in the middle.
Wow, this sounds incredibly intense. Andrew, welcome to Campaign Spotlight.
Thank you very much.
Let's get started. This is a little bit different than our usual episodes. You're going to be telling us about LARP, about live action roleplay.
Yeah.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your connection with LARP?
Absolutely. So, my name's Andrew. I have been LARPing for about 12 years now. Legacies is actually my first and only LARP. So.
Wow.
I found it I was bored one day. I had just watched a couple movies about LARPing, and I decided, you know what, I could do that. And so I Googled a LARP in Washington. I found Legacies. I found it to be a very welcoming community. I fell in love with it. And 12 years later, I'm now helping to run and organize it. So I find myself, when I go to Legacies, I have multiple characters that I play, some of which scratch the, I want to fight itch. And so I have my heavily armored character that is the sword and board frontline fighter. I have a character who's a backline wizard as he's casting spells and all of those things. And then I even have a high magic casting noble. So, yeah.
Extremely cool. And did you have any, I guess, you just kind of dove in head first with Legacies. Did you have any previous experience with, I guess, tabletop role-playing games or anything of that nature?
Yeah, so when I was in college, before I joined Legacies, I played a lot of D&D with my friends. So
Cool.
I actually started playing Dungeons and Dragons in 4th Ed. That's kind of one of those weird places where a lot of people are really back and forth as to whether or not they like 4th Ed. I feel like that's one of those that it's always people are have strong opinions about it. For me, that was my first edition, and so it kind of has a special place in my heart. I see a lot of the problems with it, but at the same time, it's one of those, well, that's where I was. And so I started role playing through Dungeons and Dragons. I've also done a little bit of playing like narrative campaigns while playing Warhammer and things of that nature. And so those were kind of my introductory into nerddom. I've also done some cosplaying at different like anime cons and things of that nature, but it was just kind of that feeling of going from someone who's playing around the tabletop to the next logical step of being the person who puts on the armor, runs around in the woods, and hits my friends with foam swords. It's a blast.
Of course, it's just like a logical progression, right?
Yeah. Anyone who likes to play D&D can become a LARPer if they have the desire.
I really like that attitude. Yeah. So D&D 4th edition is also the first version of Dungeons and Dragons that I ever saw anyone play. Because my roommate played in university with a group of like 8 other people. Mm-hmm. And to this day, it's probably the most frustrating campaign I've ever been adjacent to. They spent, I think, 6 months trying to solve a puzzle once. I really came away from, watching them play in the living room thinking that, like, wow, this is the most miserable hobby imaginable. But then when I actually tried it, I'm like, no, this is extremely fun. And I'm also curious, what were the movies about LARP that you mentioned?
So I was watching first the movie Role Models, which is, it's got some LARPing in there. It's not quite what I do, but it does have it there. And then I watched Knights of Badassdom. And so those were the 2 movies that after watching that, I was like, you know what? I could be a LARPer. I could do that.
Hell yeah. Riley is like laughing with recognition right now because I think those are the movies he thought you were going to say too.
They're actually one of the most like commonly recognized LARPing movies. I don't know them personally, but I actually know that a couple of the people in Knights of Badassdom, some of like the extras that were there as just like LARPers, actually were members of Legacies. I don't know who they were. It's just old players from like 20 years ago were they happened to be around in, I believe, Spokane is where that was filmed. And so they got kind of an all call for, hey, LARPers, if you're interested in being in a movie. And so they showed up in their garb.
Because they already have the swords. They already have the armor.
Exactly.
Extremely cool. And so you've been I guess participating in Legacies for 12 years, you said. First, I guess, as a player, and then you got into writing.
Yeah, so I started out as a player and was a player for many years. After a while as a player, I started to get a little bit more involved in the organizational side of game. I was invited to be a member of our plot team, and so I got to, for about 6 months, one of my first times just being involved in the actual organization of the game, I got to be the NPC. I got to be the bad guy. I got to be the one that was running around making sure that everyone else was having something going on in the story, and it was a lot of fun. From there, I got involved in some of our other teams. I was involved in our safety team for a while. My own inherent nature, I'm pretty good at helping other people stay organized, and so I started as one of our operations managers. I helped us build what we consider our monster manual. And then after a while, then I was invited and became one of our executive officers about 2.5, 3 years ago.
Very cool. Okay, so this has been some heavy involvement on the organizational side.
Yeah. I'm very involved in the organization now. Our organization has 3 executive officers, and so we're kind of the ones who are involved with making sure that we have sites, making sure that game runs, making sure that all of our teams are functioning. And in the event that we have like a gap in some of our storytellers stepping forward. One of the executive officers will step forward to be the storyteller for 6 months.
For 6 months at a time.
Yes. So the way that Legacies works is we've had an ongoing world for about 25 years. And so, yeah, the game world itself is a continuous living game world. The players are all members of the world. And then every 6 months, a new team kind of steps up to tell their story. And so their story is happening in the game world. The players are playing through that, and while each player comes to the game with their own story, they add their own little bit to the game itself, there's also the ongoing plot. And so while there might be other things that are happening that might take years and years and years to have accomplished, there's also the more immediate problem.
Got it. I just want to flag something for our listeners. Legacies is about 25 years old, which means that the village of Fortnite does predate the game Fortnite.
This is true, yes.
Got it. Okay. Go for it.
We also have it, it is spelled the way that, Fortnite is supposed to be spelled.
Oh,
so,
like 2 weeks. Okay.
Yeah. So yes, our Fortnite has existed longer than the game Fortnite. Our game has not actually always taken place in Fortnite. We've had a couple major shifts in our game world. I know that before my time of Legacies, the game originally took place in a country called Alba, which was basically our England equivalent, and in a small town called Scarborough. And so after a while, the executive officers of that time period decided to basically move the game from the England equivalent into Warwick to kind of give us that frontier town feel.
Was part of the goal with that move shifting from more of kind of a historical reenactment feel to more of a fantasy-based LARP, or was it primarily to be closer to the edge of civilization?
So a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. We've always been a high fantasy LARP. And right. So even when we were in our England equivalent of Alba, it was still, magic has always been real in our game. The gods have always been real in our game. And so even then, there were those things going on. But the executive officers of the time moved it because there was also a fairly large shift in the game world itself. They were expanding. As our game world has continued to exist, our game world team has constantly worked to populate the world and make it feel like a more realistic world. More countries have been sometimes discovered. Sometimes we've kind of hand waved. That country has always been there, but we've fleshed them out as we get more and more information, as we get more people. Sometimes we've had players step forward and be like, hey, I am bringing this real world culture that I would really like to adapt to Legacies. How can we do that? And so our game world team will work with them on hey, let's figure out how we can make this a real thing in our game world too, while still keeping those fantasy aspects and then keeping it to where this is a respectful depiction of people's culture. And moving it into the Warwick location also put us closer to what we call the Goblin Wastes. So there's the classic mountain range between our country and that place over there. That's
right.
There's all the terrible things that can come out of there, and so it gives plot teams a lot of freedom to say hey, here's this random monster, and the reason that it's out there is because the Goblin Wastes are a thing.
Yeah, I mean, Tolkien was right about that kind of geography. It sounds like there's maybe 3 tiers of writing going on here. Mm-hmm. There's story, which is almost like what's happening tactically, session by session, month by month. And then there's plot, which is happening over the course of many months. And then on top of that, there's world building, which is things that are canonical and don't change.
I'd almost say that there's 4 tiers.
Okay.
Because there's the world building tier, which is, as you say, the canonical, like, these are the things that are happening in our game world. And there are times where actions taken by the players or actions taken by the plot team will cause major shifts, or there will change that. But the game world is kind of our, like, this is our baseline. This is how our world exists. Then the tier above that, I would actually say, are like the player driven stories. The players who go, this is my character's backstory, this is my character's history, and that can add little things, because while the game world may say, here's the like country as a whole, we give a lot of freedom to our players to be like, hey, in this country, can I put a tiny little village that's run by a cult? Absolutely, you do you. And so our players have a lot of freedom to kind of flesh out the game world itself. And so that's kind of the next level. From there, we have our like our overall like individual session by session plot. So like you were saying, the storytelling, that individual thing there. And then there's the ongoing stories that sometimes plots will start something that may not be resolved by the end of their 6 months, and this might be something that creates either a long-term project or a long-term problem or something good that happens for a long period of time. And so that kind of gets us into that, like, it's not necessarily the plot team that's handling that, but it's going to continue on.
And in practice, how separate are the story team and plot team?
So for Legacies, really those are the same teams. Our game world team is a different team. And then our plot team are the ones who they develop the stories that players are going to be playing through on those 6 months bases. So like for myself, when I created a plot about a demonic plague, I was in charge for 6 months. I wrote all of that story. I wrote kind of the here's what's going on in the game world as a whole, and worked with the game world team on how I could impact things that were outside of the immediate area of the players. And then from there, I also created here are some of the stories that are going to go beyond that. Sometimes players will pick up those stories and they will run with them and they will continue those stories. We do have another team that is called our Environmental Encounters team. They're actually the ones who they handle a lot of personal projects so that it doesn't like overload our plot team, who it's the, hey, while all of this is going on, I also want my character to build a ranch and be a rancher. And so the plot team is like, that's really cool. I have a lot on my plate. So our environmental encounters team picked that stuff up. They're also, the environmental encounters team also tends to put out like a lot of random things in the woods, because one of the things that a lot of players like to do is, I'm going to go explore in the woods and see if there's something out there. And sometimes it's the, hey, look, that flower is literally growing money. And other times it's, that flower ate me, and now I'm stuck underground. And so we've had a lot of experience where like our environmental encounters team add the little bit of extras to the immediate play area of our LARP that allow those players who like to go out and explore to feel like they really get something out of doing that without putting yet another burden on the plot team itself.
Yeah, I think this touches on something that I'm really curious about. On the plot team, or the environmental encounters team for that matter, what does the actual interfacing with the players look like? Is there a quest board? Are you just, with these random encounters in the woods, are you just hanging things from trees and hoping the players find it? Do NPCs come up to them like in a video game? Let's talk about the demonic plague, actually, because that sounds like a really cool example. Mm-hmm. How do you communicate? Okay, I've written these storylines, or I have ideas for these storylines about a demonic plague. How do you communicate to the players a demonic plague is upon Fortnite?
So a little bit of all of the things that you mentioned are kind of what happens. So for myself, what I did was, one of the very first things I sent out was I sent out a person who was sick. And so an an NPC who was sick. They just weren't feeling well, went into the tavern where players could choose to interact with them.
Right.
And so from there, then the players are starting to talk with them. This NPC has some knowledge that they know that they're supposed to get out to the players, but it's on the players to talk to them. And when we send out NPCs, ultimately, like, we're people. And so we have that, like, you got to go and talk. And unlike an NPC in a video game where you get set lines or
Right.
they only have so many coded lines, it's ask them questions, see what they know. And other times I would send in demons to attack the town. And the thing about that is that the players, a lot of them, our game world has been around for a long time. Legacies has been running for a long time. Characters don't change some people do change, but there have been a lot of characters that exist for plot reign after plot reign after plot reign. So you get that character who's like, I've been around for like 10 years. I've never seen that demon before. That's weird. We should look into that. And so you get people who they start to see things, you start to notice things. Beyond that, we have certain skills in our game, one of which is divination. And so players can basically pick out a divination method, whether it be a real world method or something that they've come up with their own. Some players will like throw rune stones. Some will like drop wax into water to kind of like look at the shapes. We have a lot of different ways. And the way that skill works is basically the player will go and get a plot ref, so someone from the plot team, and then they will go through their process. I've had players, throw the stones and start reading, and then we'll call a quick stand down, which is basically a pause for the LARP, and then I'll move their stones around, or I'll turn certain stones over, or things like that, so that they can kind of see, based on how these stones have fallen, this is what this means. And so I've also had people, one of the things that I was particularly proud of, I had a player that went on a vision quest, more or less, for their divination. They were staring into a bowl of water. They hit it so that it would be disrupted, and they were looking for visions in the ripples. And part of my demonic plague that I sent out was that below a major city, there was this big pond that a demon was corrupting. And so they got to see that pond. But their divination, when you use the skill, we do what's called pole bags, where we have a little bag with 10 stones in it. And depending upon what color stone you draw, depends on how well things went. They drew a black stone, which is bad. And so, despite the fact that they got to see what was going on, they also then got hit with a little bit of that plague, and they themselves got to get sick for a little bit.
And how did you represent the sickness?
So we have mechanics in our game, and the mechanic for this one was pathogen. And so the characters the characters themselves might not know exactly how sick they are, but the player, they have a character card that they'll keep track of how many instances of pathogen that they would have on their card. So sometimes I might have something that goes out and affects them, and it'll like hit them with something. It'll say pathogen 1. And so then they'll put a mark on their character card. And then I had it set that every so often, as they got to those higher pathogen numbers, something would start impacting their characters. And once they started to get really high, we would use makeup to like draw like boils and things like that onto people's faces. So every now and then a person would go off, get really sick, come back to the play area, and other characters would look at them and be like, oh boy, you have boils all over your face, and that is, you're sick, we need to fix that.
Very cool. Okay, and that also answers the question I was about to ask, which is, when you send in this NPC, how are they mechanically depicting how sick they are? But I guess they just have pathogen 5 or something like that.
Yeah, on their like NPC card, we would have told them like, here's how much pathogen you have. So here's what your like role play things that are happening to you. Here's what your mechanical things that are happening to you. And then we would use makeup or something along those lines to represent the like, well, you have bags under your eyes because your character hasn't been sleeping for, well, for a week. will have the player like mime that they're coughing a lot or things of that nature. So some of it also comes down to the acting skill of the NPC. If they can really represent that they're ill in a convincing manner, it can really unsettle players, which is oftentimes what we're looking for on plot.
I can imagine. Who are these NPCs? Both the ones showing up sick, but also the ones who were showing up as demons.
So the plot team has generally 6 to 7 members on it. And so since we're an all volunteer organization, these are other members of the community. So the Legacies community will have someone who will apply to be a head of plot, and then the XOs will interview them when we're like, yep, you have a great idea. I really have faith that you're going to run the game well for 6 months. We give them a spot as a head of plot. Then they bring with them their team. And so on their plot team, that those 7 people will work together to be the NPCs. We also allow and really encourage our players, you can take a break from playing your character for a little bit and you can go an NPC. And so you can decide that you want to go up to the plot camp and you're like, hey, I want to NPC for an hour or so.
Sure.
And so then they'll be like, all right, cool. You can leave your character garb here. Here's your new makeup. Here's your new garb. Go be a demon. Or things like that.
And the people who were showing up kind of extemporaneously to do that, they might actually be in like quite plot relevant or plot relevant or plot critical NPC roles. It sounds like.
Yeah, sometimes. Oftentimes, the really, really critical roles we leave to the plot team themselves. So oftentimes we'll have like these members of the team have this character that they're like, this is what I'm going to be playing. This is what's really important for me. And then when like other players just come to NPC for an hour or so, we oftentimes will give them one of the like monsters in a wave, because one of the things that a lot of people, when they're in Legacies, you get a lot of different reasons that people love Legacies. Like for myself, I love the combat. It's a lot of fun for me. I like to have that sword and shield. I like to feel that physicality. And so when I go to Legacies, I'm always hoping that I get a couple really good fights. I'm hoping that there will be a wave of monsters. I'll get to have that moment where I feel really cool because I'm holding my shield and I'm holding back a horde of demons as they're trying to get in. Other people are really into the, I just want to sit back and role play. We have one player that she has been role playing our tavern keeper for my entire time that I've been playing. And I would say that she is the heart and soul of the town. It's the, if anyone messes with the bartender, that will get every single player to get up and rally around saving her faster than anything else in the world.
This I mean, that sounds like an extremely cool role to play, honestly, in a big ongoing LARP like this. And I think it sounds like there's a different line between what a PC and an NPC is than in tabletop gaming.
Yeah. You will still have a lot of your, like, the PCs are the players at the game. While like I as a player may choose to go and play an NPC for a little bit, when I'm in the game, when I'm playing my own characters, that's what we consider our PCs. And so like I mentioned a couple of my characters, my frontline fighter, my wizard, my like stand back noble. All of those are my PCs. If I choose to volunteer, then it would be the NPC, then I'd be some sort of monster, then I'd be some other kind of figure in the game, things like that. So it has a lot of overlap with tabletop gaming, where like the characters that the players control are the characters and everyone else is controlled by the DM. But in Legacies, it's the players that the characters control are the players, and then everything else is controlled by the plot team. And so if you think of the plot team kind of as the DM of the game, that's really kind of how that relationship goes.
That makes sense. And the people who are volunteering for an hour to be an NPC, I guess it's you do have some amount of rapport with them. You've worked with them before, and you know they're not going to go out there being like, "Blah, I'm a vampire," when you want them to be a demon or something like that.
Yeah, and we have pretty strict rules about every character that goes out has a character card. And so NPCs will have very specific character cards that also say these are the skills that you have to use, here's the combat that you're allowed to do, here's the weapons you're allowed to use, things of that nature, so that we can prevent that player from kind of going rogue and being like, hey, I'm sending you out as a generic peasant to go and like talk to people. They're like, haha, I am a grand werewolf. No, you're not. So yeah, we do have a lot of trust, and one of the things that we say is that for Legacies, the honor system is really core to our game, in that we're all playing by the same rules. We still have a rule book, just like you would in Dungeons and Dragons. We still have our monster manual where all of our monsters have very specific skills on them. We have referees that are kind of they're playing their characters, but they also can have that moment where if they see something that they're like, that's not how that works, they might pull that player off to the side and be like, hey, can we talk about what was happening there? And so we're all kind of keeping the game world fair and balanced for everyone, because at the end of the day, it's a game and we're all there to have fun. And one of the ways to have fun is to make sure that everyone's playing by the same rules.
Well, that makes that's really reasonable, and I appreciate that there's this. I appreciate that there is that level of structure where people aren't kind of being left out to do their own thing without a sense of how it's going to fit in. I guess in addition to communicating information the way you described with these NPCs, what are you doing to the environment that the players are in? I like the physical environment. Is there any change to that from session to session? Because Legacies, I guess, happens in different places from month to month, right?
So we have a couple different locations that we regularly go to. We have our immersion team that they have predetermined setups for each place. So like the town of Fortnite is kind of our main setting. And so the immersion team, when they go, they know this is how the tavern is set up. This building on the site is going to be set up as our temple. And then there'll be other things that are out and about set up. As the plot team, so taking my demon plague, for example,
Yes.
at one point, the players were out and away from Fortnite for a few months. They were at a different location. And so one of the things that I did as the head of plot was I decided that during this time, some demons had kind of moved in and messed the place up a little bit. And so when they came back, I had already put out in some of the buildings these, I was calling them plague nodules, where I built out of essentially expanding foam, a little bit of carving and paint, along with some glow sticks, these like glowing green pustule looking things that I put out and about in different buildings, and the players had to figure out how to deal with them, because ultimately it's like, well, that's where I sleep, and that's a glowing evil thing, and I need to figure out what that is before I go to sleep there, or else that's probably going to make me sick. And so
I love that as a challenge for them. Yeah. How did they respond? I guess, was it like a collaborative situation? Is everyone trying something different? Like, because I feel like with tabletop games, you kind of roll dice and then your DM is like, well, you rolled a high number, I'll tell you what this is. How does that kind of investigation of the environment work in this setting?
So in Legacies, we have a lot of different mechanical skills that players can use. One of the skills that's kind of our primary, how do I investigate and then fix this, is called our lore skill, where basically every purchase of the lore skill that you make, you
Right.
get knowledge about
Right.
some specific thing. And that allows you to ask questions of the plot team. And so with these plague nodes, I was kind of wandering around as head of plot, and players would flag me down, and I'd go over there, and they'd be like, okay, lore, and then they'd give me their list of lores that they wanted to use. What is this? How do I deal with it? and what are going to be the consequences of this action. And so then
Right.
I'd answer those questions, and then once I've answered those questions, then it's on them to role play doing that. And so essentially what they had to do is they put a rope around each of the different plague nodes, and they used a warder skill to more or less hold the energy in there. And then they did more or less kind of like a pseudo exorcism while also pouring some in our game it's quicksilver, which is the anti-demon alchemy, on this plague node to kill it and get it to like shrivel up and die. And so once they've used their lore skills to kind of talk to the head of plot about, here's what I kind of want to do, will this work? And then the head of plot can be like, yeah, sure, let's do it. Other times, if the players are like, hey, I want to do this crazy idea, the head of plot might say, that's great, let's do a pole bag. And that pole bag kind of is the representation of rolling those dice. And so from there, it's all right, you drew a white stone, that means you had an amazing success. You drew a blue stone, you succeeded, but maybe not as well as you would have liked. You draw a black stone, you did not succeed. Here's what went wrong. And then every now and then, for a little bit of extra fun, it's here's a red stone. This is now plot gets to have fun with what happened.
That's extremely... Can you give an example of a time someone drew that red stone?
Yeah, so we had a time where a player this wasn't my plot, but during a different plot, we had an invasion of Slod, which is exactly what you think they are from D&D.
Sure.
And so we had more or less a Slod queen who was, whenever you divined or scryed, which is another way to more or less like use magic to investigate something, in the pole bag, there was always a redstone. And if you drew that redstone, instead of getting what you wanted, the player would get pulled away where the plot team had set up this little like tent that had a whole bunch of stuff going on in it. They actually had, I don't know if you've ever had those like goggles that make you kind of feel like you're drunk when you're wearing them.
Sure.
Because in this area, you more or less, your character got pulled temporarily into the realm of limbo to have a conversation with the Slod Queen, where you're just looking for information, and instead you're trying to look around when you're like, I can't even focus, and the Slod Queen is having a conversation with you instead. And that is oftentimes not what people wanted to do, because that's also incredibly dangerous, because if you made the Slod Queen mad, sometimes she'd send you back in pieces.
Did that happen to any of the player characters?
Oh yes, very much so. Not everyone is as tactful as they could be when dealing with someone of enormous power.
Sure. That is incredibly high stakes. I really like that example. So, what you're describing, where initially when you said if people take a really big swing and try to do something wild, then there's the pull bag. My first thought was like, well, that almost encourages people to do something wild and something unhinged, right? And this is something that a lot of tabletop games, I think, struggle with, where the players just want to kind of mess around and do wild things. And the solution, as far as I'm concerned, is you make the consequences really high. You make it very clear to them that if they fuck around, they might find out. And it sounds like in this case with the Slod Queen, if they fucked around, oh, it's cool, I get this unique experience, but I also, my character could permadie.
Yeah. In Legacies, like, we have kind of various states of death,
Sure.
where ultimately, when you're permanently dead, it's what's called being sundered. And so a lot of characters will, I guess, die fairly regularly. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. Like, one of our spells that we throw a lot is death. And so when you get hit by that spell, it does what's on the tin. But when you really mess up, when you've died too many times, when your character has gone to spirit a couple times, then been resurrected, there's definitely the chance to sunder. And if you sunder, that's when you're like, I lost. My character's gone. Like, I gotta make a new character. There are some ways around it. We have what's called the reincarnate ritual, which can bring a sundered character back to life if it's performed within 1 year of, and like actual real world year. But if it's performed within a year of the character sundering, you can bring that character back. But every time you get brought back, your character's spirit is a little bit weaker because on our character cards, we have what's called anima, which is how strong your spirit is. You normally start with 3. And so every time you go to spirit, you lose one of those. You can buy back an anima at the end of the game each month. But if you sunder, then you go straight to 0 and your character's gone. So yeah, we do have some pretty extreme consequences. There are also times where, like, sometimes if players are trying to do something that we're like, this is going to be really detrimental to the game world as a whole, this is going to be something where we're like, we really just can't let you do that. Oftentimes it comes to, let's work out how your character can maybe do something similar, but I'm not going to let you do this thing. Like, we've had characters that they're like, I want to make myself a philosopher's stone and I want to become immortal. And it's like, that's great. That's a really good goal for your character to have. However, mechanically, allowing you to become immortal as a player will be really detrimental to the game. And so oftentimes we have those discussions with the players fairly early on of like, hey, we want you to know as a player, we are never going to let you succeed at this. Your character can absolutely be driving after this. Your character can be doing all sorts of things. We will give you tasks. We will let you do horrifying experiments to people. But you yourself are never actually going to be successful at this, just because it'll really ruin the balance of our game. And one player being immortal where everyone else is not can really just, it can take the fun away from everyone else.
I mean, arguably everyone being immortal would also take away the fun, so...
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that we joke about all the time is going to spirit lets you tell your tragic backstory to your resurrectionist. The way that resurrections work in our game is that a character with the skill resurrection basically sits there and their character is channeling energy. And while that is happening, you tell a story from your character's backstory to like draw your spirit back into your body. And so you get to have those moments where maybe your character has a super tragic backstory, because everyone likes to make their edgy characters. Or sometimes people will tell here's my really happy story, or things like that. And they'll slowly draw themselves back into their character's body. And that's a good way to kind of share, this is what my character's past looks like, even if you're not necessarily just sitting down with someone and being like, so let's talk about who I am.
Right.
That doesn't always feel realistic, because people don't do that.
Right, and it also puts a cap on how frequently you can exposit your backstory.
Exactly. Like, some people will, like, after that resurrection, the resurrectionist will be like, hey, buddy, that was rough. Do you want to talk about this? Should we maybe, like, do some friendly therapy here? And maybe your character's like, no, I don't ever want to talk about that again. I don't know what happened. Or some characters will be like, yes, let's gush about what just happened. And that can also open up some really interesting role play for characters.
Absolutely. Candidly, I think I'm going to steal that for when players in my home tabletop games go down.
Feel free.
Because I'm always at somewhat of a loss as to, obviously, if it's like a warlock, they have a patron that will communicate with them or something like that. But in general, I'm at a loss for what to do when someone is, dead or close to it. And we know they're going to be able to come back. There's magic, but what they can do in that moment. I guess I should apologize on air to Chris, our guest from Season 1, Episode 8. When Chris was DMing for me, every time my Paladin PC went down, I demanded that Chris have the deity, talk to me, tell me what was going on. Maybe give a little bit more backstory about the quest we were on. And initially it was kind of just like a silly joke, and then I was like, oh boy, I'm being kind of demanding as the player whose PC goes down pretty much every session. So no, but I am gonna adopt that. I think that is a really natural time for that exposition to happen.
Yeah, it's just a really it's something that I've always particularly enjoyed. We've also a lot of players will kind of do something like special for how they tell their backstories. Some characters will decide like, okay, this character doesn't actually have these memories. Maybe they have them blocked away because they're hugely traumatic and they have that mental block. But during a resurrection, they'll tell that, or like this character has amnesia. And so
Ooh,
the only time that they get those memories is during a resurrection. For my noble character, I made myself a recovering Dark Lord because I think that it's a really fun way to do that. And in D&D, they're called the Hollow One, where it's the character that has died and then come back to life.
sure.
In our game, they're called Dampari, where it is someone who, at some point in their life, has died. And then one of the gods has basically allowed them to come back to life for a second chance. And so my character was executed in a peasant uprising because he was a terrible noble. But the way that his resurrections go is that when he is being resurrected, the story that he's telling, he's kind of convinced himself that this is how it went. But as I'm telling the resurrection story, I have the memory kind of crack where the real story comes out. And so it's also something for the character himself to have to deal with in like
Right.
he's convinced himself, well, I'm this proud noble who has never done anything wrong, and then he's forced to confront the fact that like, oh, I did terrible things and I am a terrible person and I need to be better.
Do do PCs get to be terrible people within the game?
Yes. Ultimately, you can make your character whatever you want. There are a couple rules that we have in place. You can't be a vampire. You can't be a werewolf. You can't be like an actual monster, mostly
Right.
because like your character can turn into those. We have vampiric infections. We have werewolf infections. However, when you fully turn, you then that character essentially sunders and becomes an NPC, and you
Right.
are no longer allowed to play them as a player. That's largely to again keep that game balance in the world of like having someone who I have all of my character power and also vampire powers can make it really difficult. But players are ultimately allowed to have their goals. We've had players that are thieves and pickpockets. We've had players that they are kind of the crazy killers. The thing about it is that there are a lot of ways to investigate what people are doing. And so it's oftentimes difficult to get away with it. You'll most of the time get caught. And with our game culture, we're a much more like PvE type culture where it's really the players versus plot. We do
Yes.
have moments where like two players will fight. We do have times where player characters don't get along and things of that nature. But we kind of try and keep it mostly that like we are working together. And so oftentimes we've had things where like player versus player issues, uh, even if they started character versus character, can kind of spread into the actual player versus player. And so we
Right.
try to make sure that those things are handled in such a way that like the players themselves don't get upset. Um, Now, rules around, like, say, stealing and being a thief character, we have balanced with the fact that, like, if your character does steal an item, you have to go and report that to the plot team. Because that way, if someone does a divination or a scry or something like that, where they're looking for that item that has been
Right.
stolen, it can be found. Because ultimately, it's the I have high magic, I should be able to look into the person who stole my sword, and without that person reporting it to plot, then ultimately I can't because
Right.
I don't know how to do that. I don't actually have high magic. So with the plot team being able to run that, we can have those moments where it's like if I'm playing a thief and I see that someone's coin purse is sitting there on the table and I just sort of pocket that, then I'll go to plot and be like, hey, I just pocketed this coin purse, just so you know. And then if someone looks for it later, plot is able to answer with like, oh, it was that person. You see that person doing it.
Right.
And then they'll come after me.
Right. Okay. This makes a ton of sense for the PvP end of things and how, I guess, I mean, I feel like this is a really overused term when we talk about running games. How player agency works in PvP makes sense. I'm really curious as to what player agency looks like in these PvE situations. You know, can the players take unexpected or off the rails actions that meaningfully affect the long run plot, the overall environment, or is that something that, due to the large scale of this endeavor, you kind of have to shut down once it starts?
So ultimately, it really depends on what the players want. During one of my plot reigns, we had a character who basically transitioned into an NPC. One of the members of my plot team, he kind of wanted to retire his character, but his character was one of those long-running evil characters. And he's like, I don't really want to play this character anymore, but I want him to have his like blaze of evil glory. And so what we decided is that we made him one of the villains of our story. And so his story was basically that he was using high magic to try and tap into one of the stars to pull magic down to himself. And he was trying to ascend to godhood through that.
As one does.
Yeah, and along the way, he was doing a lot of damage to the natural world because his high magic was basically like creating living spells that were going around and doing things. He was doing a lot of damage, and we had planned for this player, or this character, to go out on the second month of our game, kind of do a big thing. The players would kill him. His spirit would walk away. He'd get to have that monologue of, you haven't seen the last of me, and he'd wander away. Instead, what happened is the players decided that they were really terrified of this particular character. They were really terrified of what he could do. And so they pulled out a Sunder ritual, which is one of the biggest guns that the players have. It's I'm going to read this magic paper, and if I succeed, my target dies. If I don't succeed, I die. And so it's a very, very high risk ritual. And so that's what they decided to do there. And so as the plot team, we were like, well, we really kind of planned on having this guy come back later, but also this is what the players want. So we decided to adjust. We shifted. We're like, all right, cool. This is what they're doing. They're killing him this month. That's the way the story is going. And so we got to have that moment where like the player agency really decided like, okay, this story that we intended to have go longer, it's getting cut short because of the fact that they made this decision. They were successful in their ritual, and in the midst of his like, I'm going to start trying to monologue, they're just like, nope, and got him.
I really like that because it seems like the player's response is really based in the kind of emotions and perceptions of the characters, and not so much in like, how can we optimally min-max this encounter?
Yeah, Legacies is one of those that, like, you can build a character that has kind of been min-maxed, and
sure,
you can do that, but you can also just build a character that you're going to have fun playing. And what we oftentimes suggest for players is that don't try and come into our game and be like, okay, do you need a healer? Do you need a tank? Do you need DPS? Like, that's not what needs to happen in Legacies.
That's the other kind of Fortnite.
Exactly. There's 30 people in our game. There's gonna be healers. There's gonna be frontliners. There's going to be all sorts of people. So it's really, what are you going to have fun doing? How do you want to engage with our game? And that's what people build. And so that really does give people a lot of freedom. One of the other ways that people can really kind of affect the overall story is that, like, going back to my idea of my demon plague, the way to cure that, I came up with a couple ideas and I had them written down as like, all right, if the players have the right lores, if they're really stumped on their own, I'll give them these.
Right.
But also, I kind of left a lot of space open for what do the players want to do? How do they want to solve the problem? And so I had one of the players came up with this idea that I had never considered, where he created more or less this like shamanistic sweat lodge where he converted one of the buildings into he kind of like built a little humidifier that was in a immersive box that was letting out, you know, little bits of steam and things like that. His character made this like specialized soup with a lot of different things to like help combat plague. They used some quicksilver over the like rocks that were over top of the like fire for the sweat lodge, and they created this like whole scenario that through his shamanistic abilities, the like soup that he was providing, and then the aerosolized quicksilver, it would help to combat the plague and remove some of that pathogen that I talked about earlier from your character. And so that was something that I had never considered, but it was a really cool idea, and I let the player roll with it because it's like, hey, this is how he wants to cure the plague. Awesome, let's do it.
That is extremely cool. I guess, what advice would you give? So a lot of our listeners play a lot of tabletop games and think LARP sounds really cool and want to get into it and want to get started. What kind of advice would you give to them about how to make that jump?
Well, really, I'd say dive in head first. Ultimately, my suggestion is first look for the LARP that is going to fit what you're looking for. Legacies is a high fantasy LARP. So if you're someone who high fantasy is what you're looking for, that's the setting that you want, then it's a great place for you. There are also those like Shadow Accord is going to be a here's the World of Darkness LARP. I know that there's Dystopia Rising, which is going to be the here's your zombie LARP. Like there are a lot of different types of LARP, and so look at what you really like. If you're looking to make the jump from D&D to LARP, I would suggest Legacies. Beyond the fact that it's my LARP, it's a really good like connection. It's a way that you can bring that. But what I also really suggest to players is that I don't necessarily recommend trying to port your character from Dungeons and Dragons over to Legacies. I don't suggest like, oh, I want to be this character from an anime, or I want to be this character. Build a person that is a person in a game world, because one of the things that I oftentimes find in D&D is that your player party of like 5 people really are the main characters of the story. And
that's what you're trying to do. You're being the legendary heroes.
Exactly. And so having that backstory of I'm the chosen one who found the special like sword of whatever is totally acceptable when it's a group of 4 people and the 4 people are all the chosen one. That's fine. In Legacies, you're not going to be. You're not going to be the chosen one. And as powerful as some of my own characters are, because one of my main characters was my very first character. I've been playing him for 12 years, and I would still not call him the main character of a game, despite the fact that he is one of the most powerful fighters in game. But if I tried to stand alone against an entire like horde of enemies, I'm going to lose. I'm going to get overwhelmed. There's just going to be too many enemies for me. And so there's no real like this player is the main event. And if you come in with that kind of mindset, oftentimes the character won't feel as fulfilling to you. Whereas if you come in with the mindset of I'm building a person who's a part of the world, they can still have their thing that makes them special and unique, and that's encouraged and good. But you still want to kind of be a person and be a part of the town. Because if I had to say the main character of Legacies is the town of Fortnite as a whole and no individual.
That is a very solid pitch for how to build a character for a LARP. Although now I am trying to imagine, a plot where you pull everyone aside one by one and say, "You're the chosen one. You're the main character," and tell it to everyone and see how they do.
I've had thoughts in the past of, especially with like fey creatures, maybe a lot of fun. I've thought in the past of like, oh, this fairy is telling a story, and so they're gonna just walk up to someone and point at them and be like, "You're the main character. Here's your script. Go."
Right.
And then if they do it wrong or something goes wrong, or the fairy's like, "Nope, this isn't right," and take the script away from them and walk up to someone else and be like, "You're the main character." I think that could be really fun. The only thing that I could see about that is that it would be difficult to engage huge amounts of people, because it'd take a lot of time to make sure that you're
Yes.
getting to everyone in that route. And there are characters who, the moment a fairy walks up to them with a piece of paper, they're going to be like, "Nope," and run out the door. So, there definitely have been times where it's like pull a character aside and like try and lead them astray. My wife actually was ahead of plot at one point that she was her story had this really powerful lich that her lich was more or less trying to become the god of undeath, who this lich believed was her like great grandfather. So she's like, "I'm gonna become the god of undeath alongside him." And so
Right.
one of the things that she was doing is that she would pull some of the Dampari players aside and be like, "Hey, you have a greater connection to undeath than anyone else. You should come over here and join me." And she'd kind of see if she could pull them along that road to damnation. And so sometimes you do get those moments where like a head of plot might be pulling someone along or pulling them aside. And so you can have those moments of like, "Hey, you're kind of a main event here." But at the same time, in like the greater story, what you have going on is kind of a small part of it.
That makes sense. In your time writing story or running plot, what were some sources of inspiration? What were the we talked a little bit about this earlier. What were the pieces of media that you felt you were really taking a lot from to like flesh out the world of Legacies?
Well, my demon plot was my Warhammer 40k plot. I'm a Death Guard player when I play Warhammer 40k, so my demon plot was, can I bring Nurgle into Legacies? And I did. And so we created a lot of plague demons for me to kind of spread into the game world.
Hell yeah.
We created a lot of different like ways for that to kind of go about. My final big bad evil guy was this greater plague lord who was more or less a blight lord terminator. And so like that was mine. We've had players pull from all sorts of different media where every now and then you look at something, you're like, "Wait a minute, I think I recognize this from that fantasy story," and they'll be like, "Yes, kind of true." We've also had players where we had a whole bunch of little storybook type things going on where we had Snow White and the Seven. In our game world, they're called Dverg, which is, I believe, like Norwegian for dwarf.
Okay.
But we more or less had that story where there were seven Dverg players who would come in, and they all had something different going on with them, and they just happened to be, sleepy, grumpy, all of those things. And the Snow White was under a sleeping curse, and we had to fix
Sure.
that. We've had a lot of different stories along those lines that kind of come up. Let's see here. We've also had stories of like people trying to think about like, how would I implement this? From the very first plot teams that I was part of, I wanted to implement, what would alien abductions look like in a fantasy world?
Ooh.
And so I used a fairy creature that I would more or less just sort of walk into town, find the nearest person, use an alchemy called Hypnos, which is basically sleeping gas, knock them out, and then I would transport away with them. More or less, my character would disappear, and I
Sure.
had I had a tent set up where I had a little cot. I had a red flashlight hanging above, and I would kind of run them through a role play of my character as dissecting them alive.
Oh no.
It was really fun because we had a fanny pack that more or less had like some cloth like guts and a liver and a kidney and things like that. And so as I'm dissecting them, I'm like pulling out a liver and they're watching me do all of this, and their characters are horrified, but also we've used the spell immobilize so that their character can't move, and just kind of run them through this like, hey, here's a scary encounter that you go through. And so I got to terrorize the town as a Fey abductor for a while, and that was a lot of fun. And so it just kind of comes down to, what are the sorts of things that you like to do on plot, and
Sure.
how are you going to have fun? And a lot of the players will really react well to that. And a story that you're really excited to tell is
Right.
also going to go over well with the players.
That makes a lot of sense. And this abduction story sounds unhinged in a really fun way.
It was a blast. I take a lot of pride in the fact that a lot of the players almost hated my random side character that was the abductor more
Sure.
than like the main big bad evil guy. Like the main big bad evil guy was trying to like spread corruption across the world and turn everyone into purple goo, which was bad, but like
That is bad, yes.
I was going forth and I was abducting people and vivisecting them. So let's extra kill that one.
Did they extra kill that one?
They sure did. Now, I was playing an immortal fairy creature, so really the monster, when they killed it, they sent me back to the fairy world for a year and a day. And then when I finally was able to come back a year later, they're like, we're going to make a deal with you so that you never get to come back again. And then they sort of forced a deal on me that I'm like, oh, now I can never terrorize you again. But that was also a really good way for the players to like feel like they had a really strong way to prevent this character from ever doing something like that again.
Absolutely. They actually did get to change the world in a little bit of a... And you, as the person running story, didn't say, oh, I'm the identical twin of that character and I'm back.
Nah, that character, it's the, once you defeat him, he's defeated, and that's fine. And so, those, sometimes we realize that, like, the players, they need that win. And so,
Absolutely.
as plot, one of the things that we always suggest to our plot teams is, you're building your story to lose. Whatever your story is, your goal is ultimately to lose. Because if you're building your, I'm the great demon that's going to spread plague across the world, yeah, but I don't actually want to destroy the game world after my 6 months are up. I kind of want my characters to come back and be like, hey, how's everything going? Everything's fine? Yeah, cool. This isn't a plague-infested wasteland. So, like, ultimately, it's as attached as I am to this story that I have spent, 6 months crafting and poured a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into, I do want it to lose. And I want the players to have that win, but I also want them to feel like they got it just by the skin of their teeth. I want them to work for it.
That sounds extremely fun. Andrew, other than Legacies, is there anything that you would like to plug to our audience?
I mean, I highly recommend, like, pretty much any LARP in Washington. I've heard a lot of good things about a lot of the different LARPs. I know that just playing D&D is a great way for me to get additional members in my LARP, because maybe I'll get more people like myself that they'll jump from Dungeons & Dragons to a LARP.
Right.
I always recommend going to Ren fairs and things of that nature. Like, all of those are great ways to kind of find yourself something that you really enjoy doing.
I really like that as a pitch. And we will, for the record, we will absolutely link to Legacies LARP in the show notes for any listeners who are in this part of the world and interested in playing with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been fascinating. It sounds like you have a lot of fun with this game, and I don't know, it just sounds like such a fun world to play in.
It really is a blast. It's a great way to spend a weekend once a month, and you kind of get to put all of your real world worries aside and just really immerse yourself in a character. And it's such a cathartic way to like kind of, I've been really stressed this week. My job has been hard this week. And this weekend, I just get to go out and hit things with a sword, and I get to do so in a safe way. I get to do so with a big group of friends who have become some of my very best friends. And so it's a really, really fun way to kind of get yourself involved. And it's also a weirdly active nerd hobby. And so if you're ever like, hey, I wish that I was doing something a little bit more active with my life, I really want to get myself up and out of the gaming chair, come LARP. By the end of the weekend, you won't even realize that you've hiked 12 miles. So,
Wow.
yeah, you'll have found I have walked all over this game site. I have walked all over the place, and you'll just realize I am exhausted and dead tired, and it's that really good physical tired feeling of I did a lot of exercise. And so it's a weirdly physical hobby that still is super nerdy, and you don't even realize that you're getting the exercise.
There we go. Yeah, LARPing will get you swole.
That's always the hope.
Thank you again so much.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me. I love having opportunities to talk about my LARP.
That's all for this week,
I'm Dungeon Inspector Jake.
and I'm Production Master Riley.
If you enjoy the show, consider subscribing and leaving a review, which helps other people find Campaign Spotlight.
If you'd like to support our work, consider going to patreon.com/campaignspotlight and becoming a patron.
And if you want to commune with the great and terrible elder spirits, start chanting the spell while I light some candles.
For more on the show, including links to all our social media, visit folderfrequencies.com/campaignspotlight.